I stood outside his door, my body frozen in place. My heartbeat echoed in my ears so loudly that I feared he might hear it. Every part of me screamed to turn away, to leave. But when he looked up and caught my gaze, something inside me softened. I should have walked away, but instead, I found myself stepping closer. That night altered everything, and there was no turning back. My name is Sarah, and I'm 42 years old. For the longest time, I believed I had everything I needed: a loving husband, a beautiful home, and a life that felt secure. My husband, Mark, was 45, always working and constantly on the move. His job as a regional sales manager kept him away on business trips, and when he wasn't traveling for work, he'd take on extra driving jobs to make some extra money. He was dedicated, but his absence left me feeling lonely in ways I didn't always acknowledge. Our house sat at the edge of a serene coastal town, where sunsets painted the sky in vibrant oranges and the waves whispered to the shore. It was beautiful, but it often felt empty. At first, I convinced myself I was happy, but over time, the quiet evenings spent alone and the solitary dinners began to weigh on me. Then, there was Alex, Mark's 20-year-old son from his previous marriage. He had always been polite but distant, and I never expected we would develop any real connection. When Alex lost his job, he asked to stay with us for a while. Mark didn't hesitate, and I had no reason to object. After all, we were family, or so I told myself. At first, Alex seemed unchanged, quiet, reserved, but over time, he started to seem more vulnerable, less guarded. Recently, he had dropped out of college and was uncertain about his next steps. I felt for him, and I did my best to make him feel welcome. However, as the days passed, I started noticing something unsettling. It was the way he looked at me, like I wasn't just his stepmother. At first, I dismissed it, thinking I was overthinking things. But as time went on, the lingering glances, the small smiles, and even the accidental touches became harder to ignore. I kept telling myself it was harmless, just a young man going through a rough patch, but deep down, I knew something was changing. Every time we were alone, the air between us seemed heavier, thick with an unspoken tension. I tried to focus on my responsibilities, cooking, cleaning, staying busy, but no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen. It started with little things, moments that I tried to brush off but couldn't forget. One evening, Mark was away on another business trip, and Alex and I shared dinner. The sound of the waves outside filled the silence between us, and for the first time, I realized how easy it had become to be in each other's company. He asked about my day, his voice softer than usual. When our eyes met, a knot tightened in my stomach. It wasn't just a passing glance, it lingered, too long, too intentional. I quickly forced a smile and changed the subject, but the damage was done. Later that night, I was washing dishes at the sink while Alex sat at the table, scrolling through his phone. I could feel his eyes on me. Every movement I made felt magnified. Was I leaning too far forward? Was my shirt too tight? My hands trembled as I reached for a towel to dry the dishes. "Sarah," he suddenly said, and my heart skipped a beat. "You've been so kind to me since I moved in. I don't know what I would have done without you." His words were innocent enough, but the way he said them made my cheeks burn. I muttered a quick, "You're welcome," then hurried to my room and closed the door behind me. I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, that I was reading too much into simple gestures. But then it happened again and again. I'd catch him staring at me, his gaze lingering whenever I bent down or moved around the house. I tried to ignore it, but my mind kept replaying those moments, twisting them into something more complex. One night, as I folded laundry, he walked past my bedroom door and stopped in the doorway. "You always look so put together," he said, his eyes briefly dropping to the curve of my hips before meeting mine again. I laughed nervously. "Thanks, Alex. That's sweet." But there was nothing sweet about the way he looked at me. The tension between us grew with every passing day. When Mark was home, Alex acted like nothing had changed. But when we were alone, it was different. The air crackled with an intensity one didn't know how to explain. I began dressing more conservatively, avoiding anything that might attract his attention. But even as I told myself he was just a kid, my stepson, and that I was married, I couldn't deny the warmth that flared up whenever he brushed past me or sat too close on the couch. One afternoon, as I lay on the porch reading, Alex joined me. He sat down beside me, and his knee brushed against mine. I felt my breath catch. "Do you ever think about what life would be like if things were different?" he asked, his voice low. "What do you mean?" I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "Just different," he said, his eyes locking with mine. In that moment, everything felt dangerously close to crossing a line, like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing one wrong move could send me tumbling. I knew I should get up, walk away, but I didn't. Instead, I stayed, letting the moment stretch longer than it should have. And that's when I knew this wasn't going to end well. Later that evening, the house felt unusually quiet. Mark had left early for another work trip, and Alex had just returned from a job interview. I sat on the porch, sipping iced tea, trying to focus on the book in my hands, but my mind was a tangled mess. I heard the door slide open behind me, and Alex appeared, his presence filling the space. He sat down beside me, closer than he ever had before. I could feel the heat of his skin next to mine. "I think the interview went well," he said, his voice steady but soft. I smiled, forcing myself to sound normal. "I'm sure you did great. You always work hard." He turned to face me, and the weight of his gaze made everything feel different. The tension between us was palpable. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "you've been the only person who's ever made me feel like I belong." I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, his fingers brushed mine. It was almost accidental, but it sent a spark of heat through my skin. I should have pulled away. I should have stopped it, but I didn't. Instead, I let it linger, testing boundaries I knew I shouldn't cross. "We're family, Alex," I said weakly, trying to break the tension. "That's what we are." He met my gaze, his eyes intense. "Because it doesn't feel that way." The words hung between us, thick with danger. My heart pounded in my chest as I struggled to find the words to say. But my body betrayed me. I didn't move, didn't speak. I just stood frozen, caught in the moment. When I stepped through the door, Alex was standing there, his hair tousled as if he had just woken up, or maybe hadn't slept at all. His eyes met mine, and in them, I saw the same unease that had been growing inside me. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice carrying a weight of unspoken things. I didn't wait for him to say anything else. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. For a moment, neither of us moved. The tension in the air was thick, and even though part of me wanted to step back, something else kept me rooted to the spot. Alex stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. Our eyes locked, and the moment seemed to stretch. I knew what was happening, what we were both avoiding. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to walk away. I tried to think of Mark, of the years we had spent together, but the doubt in my heart drowned out those thoughts. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. My mind raced, guilt and confusion mingling as the weight of my actions settled in. After everything had happened, I couldn't bring myself to stay any longer. "I need to go," I whispered, sitting up and reaching for my clothes. "Stay," Alex said softly, his voice full of something I couldn't quite decipher. I turned to face him, my heart heavy. "We can't keep doing this," I said, even though a small part of me wondered if I even meant it. I slipped out of his room, back to my bed, where Mark was still fast asleep. As I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I wondered how things had gotten so complicated. How had I allowed myself to be in this position? The next morning, the silence between Alex and me was palpable. Whenever our eyes met, there was an unspoken understanding, and it terrified me. I couldn't let this continue, but I didn't know how to stop it. Everything changed when Mark came home early. He had been out for a business trip, and as I cleaned up in the kitchen, I heard him call from upstairs, "Where's Alex?" In his room, I replied, trying to keep my voice calm. But when Mark went upstairs, something about the way he moved made my heart skip a beat. I followed him, feeling the dread build with every step. The door to Alex's room was slightly open, and I froze when I heard Mark's voice from inside. "What is this?" I pushed the door open wider and saw it, the text messages. Mark was holding Alex's phone, his face a mix of disbelief and anger. The messages were clear, and they made my stomach turn. Sarah, Mark turned to face me, his voice shaking. Tell me this isn't what it looks like. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Alex stood frozen, pale, and silent. It's not, I began, but Mark cut me off, his fury evident. Don't lie to me, he shouted, throwing the phone against the wall. The sound of it shattering made my chest tighten. How long has this been going on? I couldn't answer. I was suffocating, trapped by my own guilt. Mark's hands balled into fists, and I feared for a moment that he might hurt Alex. But instead, he turned to me, his eyes full of betrayal. You disgust me, he spat, before storming out of the room. I sank to the bed, trembling. Alex tried to comfort me, but I pushed him away. This was a mistake, I said through tears, but even as the words left my mouth, I wasn't sure if I believed them. Mark packed his bags that night. He didn't speak to me, didn't look at me. I sat alone, lost in the devastation of my choices. In the days that followed, the house felt hollow. The silence was unbearable. I couldn't stop replaying the moment Mark left, the look in his eyes haunting me. Alex tried to offer comfort, but his presence only intensified my guilt. I couldn't look at him without remembering everything. Mark hadn't called or texted. I couldn't stop thinking about him, about what I had lost. Every small thing in the house reminded me of him, the laughter we once shared, the scent of his cologne. Alex, however, acted as if nothing had changed. He still asked about my day, still cooked breakfast, still lingered too close whenever we were alone. One night, Alex stepped into my room without knocking. You can't keep hiding like this, he said, his voice soft but firm. I looked at him, my eyes swollen from crying. Do you even understand what we've done? He stepped closer, his expression serious. I understand, he said, his voice steady. And I don't regret it. His words struck me like a blow. I wanted to hate him, to push him away, but part of me understood. How could he not regret it? My marriage was over, my life in ruins, and yet there was something in his words that made me question everything. I can't do this, I whispered, turning away from him. Alex reached out, grabbing my arm gently. You don't have to face this alone, he said. I pulled away from him. Yes, I do, I replied, my voice barely audible. I had to make a choice. The next morning, I told Alex he needed to leave. He didn't argue. Instead, he silently packed his things. Before leaving, he looked back at me. If you ever change your mind. I didn't let him finish. I closed the door, shutting him out. I was alone. I tried to move forward, but the guilt and regret followed me everywhere. Every sound in the house, every thought, felt like a reminder of what I had lost. Mark never reached out, and I knew I didn't deserve it.